There was a terrible disaster in the world. An announcer on the radio warned people to lock all doors and not to go outside. If one was attacked and wounded, the skin began to rot and the shape of the body became strange. The survivors began to call this infectious disease corrosion. The black-haired boy opened his eyes abruptly, his gaze staring at the moon peering through the bars, which was a blood-red color. The glasses were on the nightstand. The guy getting out of bed and putting the glasses on. He was a little surprised he slept through the night. He was in a room that looked like a school. It was dark everywhere. A line of light flashed, showing the nurse's station sign. The guy was walking down the hallway, thinking no one had woken him up. Suddenly, he saw the body of a young man ahead. He was sprawled all over the corridor. The black-haired man made a strange sound as he approached him. Suddenly, the boy heard a strange sound. He turned his head warily and saw a man's hand in the window. He opened his eyes fearfully and looked ahead. There in the darkness could be seen a crowd of undressed people. At first glance, it might seem, but these were not human beings. Their skin was falling away from their bodies, flocking and hanging in scraps. Their mutilated mouths made snarling noises, and their eyes glowed red in the darkness. One of the infected had his intestines out, hanging to the floor. The guy stood in a stupor. He suddenly looked out the window across the street and saw the guy there. He was also standing there, looking warily ahead. They stared at each other for a while. But then that guy's face and body were covered in rotten hands with gnarled nails. That guy called for help from the main character. His name was Seonho, and the scary visions went away. The black-haired guy was squatting against the wall with his head down. Opposite him was a blonde-haired guy. He immediately guessed that his comrade was having that dream again. The black-haired man put his glasses on the bridge of his nose. The blonde watched him and said nothing. He suddenly asked worriedly if it had come. The black-haired man said nothing. He pointed his rifle. They were in a dilapidated building. The infected walked below, snarling and looking for prey. But suddenly its head shattered into small pieces, staining the asphalt with blood. The blonde was surprised at how the guy killed it with one shot. He was about to say that even though they had trained together, the one was still better, when he saw that the black-haired man was about to throw away his weapon. The guy didn't understand why he would throw it away, but it didn't have any more cartridges in it. The blonde still felt sorry for it. He had hope of finding ammo, but the black-haired man said it would be hard to carry. The blonde tried to convince him in a low voice that it was safe to walk around with a gun, because it would instill fear in others. The guy realized that his comrade was more comfortable with a gun and agreed to leave it behind. The boy squatted down. The blonde watched him, then asked him to give him the gun to throw away, because they wouldn't find any ammunition anyway, and Seongho was carrying a lot of weight on his shoulders. They walked out of the building. The blonde-haired man asked Seonho to listen to him. He told him that because he was protecting him, he was a useless person that everyone threw away. The boy walked forward, not noticing the black-haired man continuing on with him, stopped and looked back. Seonho stood and asked firmly who told him that. In another dilapidated building, a man was hit in the face. The injured man screamed. The others stirred. The blonde man called out to Seonho worriedly. The guy was angry. They lived in a flimsy world that was barely holding together. There was no need to waste energy on useless things. Even he felt bad for wasting energy to explain to the man why he hit him. The guys were yelling about what had gotten into Seonho, the black-haired man approaching the man, deciding to omit the details and give him a good punch. But the injured man wanted to know why he had been hit so hard in the face. The other kid also tried to calm the black-haired man down and explain what had happened. Suddenly, the guys called out to young Haesu, guessing his handiwork. The guy shuddered in fear. While the guy was hiding behind Sonyo's back, the guys realized that the blonde-haired guy had been talking behind their backs again. Because other than him, there was no reason for the guy's mind to go flying. The man with the broken nose yelled that he never liked them. The other guy excitedly asked him to calm down. Meanwhile, the man didn't listen to him. He yelled that the guys didn't trust them and were afraid that they would steal something from them, and they never considered them as comrades. But today, he promised to deal with them, shivering with his whole body. The guy called out to Chon Han-hyun fearfully. Everyone immediately became silent and turned towards the guy. There was a man lying on the floor with a deformed arm. It was stretched out and was like a rag. A black-haired guy was squatting beside him. The guy had been bitten 3 days ago. Now his body had rotted and started to change. Now they didn't know what to do with Daehan. First, his older brother had died, and now his younger brother was infected. But the guys already knew that the younger one couldn't be left alive, though one of the guys had hope. because he was still in his mind, but it couldn't be left like that. Everyone was silent. The blonde-haired man worriedly kept close to Sonho. The guy asked him not to worry and promised that they wouldn't attack him. The guys went to pull Daehan away from his younger brother, with a broken nose assuring him that there was nothing good about watching this. The guys were holding him. Sonho stood across from them with a knife in his hand. The middle brother saw it. He knew what would follow. As the kid was dragged away, he kept looking at Sonho with a venomous stare. The black-haired man approached the infected. The kid immediately called out to him. The kid asked to be sent to the other world like he had done to his older brother. Sonho adjusted his glasses. The infected saw no good in living in this guise. But the boy didn't agree with him. He thought it was better to live than to die, in any guise. The guys stepped back in disgust. They were glad that Sonho was with them because no one else would have been able to take that step. The blonde-haired man sat apart from them, resting his face in his lap. He understood that his friend cared at all. He knew that in reality, Sonho was scared and had a fragile heart. The black-haired man promised to finish quickly, that he wouldn't even feel the pain. The guy was having that horrible dream again. Suddenly, he flinched. Daehan loomed over him with a scary look, with a hint of madness. The black-haired man was already awake and felt the boy looming over him. He spoke up, saying that he was the one who had sent first his older brother and now his younger brother to the other side of the world. The guy replied that he had no other choice. Daehan understood that, but it was a world where it was hard to bear what he was saying. It was impossible to live without holding a grudge against someone in his heart, and now needed someone he would hate like crazy. The guy scarily promised to watch Sonho until the very end. He would see what kind of horrible and violent death he would end up with. Daehan got up and staggered off into the darkness. Seongho remained seated, young Hesu sleeping peacefully beside him. He stroked his head, frowning, staring ahead. A boy in a yellow hat was running down the street. He joyfully informed his comrades that a little boy from the neighboring district had returned to them. Everyone was delighted with such news. The kid, all exhausted and small wounds across his face, told the guys that the survivors on their side were either sick or weak. They needed strong people. So when he told them about them, his men rejoiced at the news. The guy promised that if they gave them protection, they would share their supply of provisions with them. The boys were glad. They laughed, for they were always worried about running out of provisions one day. But then the boy, trembling, asked to listen to him. He seriously said that if they agreed, they should go right now because he was anxious for his boys. Everyone followed this kid to his camp. One of the guys noticed that they were already walking for a long time. And after all, he came from a neighboring area. They came to a large building and went inside. It was spacious and clean. There was not a single sign of an attack. The guys were very surprised by this. Suddenly, a strange young man appeared in front of them. He stared creepily at the guys. Everyone stared back at him. The guy chuckled eerily and suddenly shouted to his guys that the newcomers had pulled up. There was an echo. Noise, noise, noise. People came out from all the floors throughout the room. The men were screaming like fiends. They were surprised that the guys didn't look sick and were in good shape. The guys stared up at the upper floors in shock. The blonde one frightenedly wrapped his arm around Sonyo's arm. The guy who got punched in the nose was puzzled, for the man was telling them something completely different. Suddenly, the exasperated guys saw young Hesu. They thought he was a cute kid. They hooted even louder. The man started arguing over who would be first with young Hesu. While they were deciding, the kids scooted over to Sonho and looked up fearfully. The black-haired man was angry. One more or less adequate guy called the guys names, because they were off the hook again, and they were having trouble finding and bringing people in. He turned to the other guy, asking if they were going to leave it alone, and noticed that this time the hype would stand for a long time. But the guy didn't listen to him and didn't answer anything. He suddenly turned to Sonho, wondering if he was hot. The kid in the blue jacket looked surprised at the guy in charge. The mixed-eyed guy said the guy with glasses came to his liking, so he picks him. A blonde man ran up to young Hesu and grabbed his hand, squeezing it painfully. The man said with distraught eyes that a cute kid had come to them. They hadn't had a crop like this in a long time. He squeezed his hand even tighter, causing the blonde to scream, and Sonho slammed his forehead into the man's nose, blood spurting from the blonde's nose. His companions watched in shock. The man angrily grabbed Sonho by the hood and was about to pile on, but a guy in a blue jacket came down to them. He asked Yunchol to keep his cool, because he had warned him not to make a commotion every time the newcomers came. The kid took him by the shoulder. Yoon-chul confusedly asked him to stay out of the way. In a blue twist, asked him to wait 5 minutes. The men from the balconies asked for a continuation. They wanted to see something fun after such a long time. They loved that the newcomers came with character. The guy in the blue jacket greeted the guys. He was the one who had sent people out to search many times, but they only came now. He considered them cautious guys. The guys were silent. The people on the balconies were yelling. The people who came in assumed the kid was the leader here. The guy in the jacket was something like that. The place looked better than they'd been described, so the kid assumed the guys were glad to be here. But the guys were warily silent. The jacket explained that if the guys would help them, they would share their supplies. The guy also said that since it took them so long to get here, to join them, he greeted the newcomers with a creepy face. Seeing their wary mood, he asked them to relax. The guy's name was Do Young-shin. The one with the broken nose was Xiangho's comrade's name was Jung Gong-woo, and the other was Oh Jonhan. They introduced themselves to Young-shin. Jung-gon turned to Jonhan Hyun, but the guy asked him to stand still for starters. Suddenly, they were interrupted by Yoon-chul. Blood from his nose flowed into his mouth, making spitting sounds. He noticed that 5 minutes had expired. Young-shin looked at Seonho, who was looking at him incredulously. Do Young-shin smirked, noting that the guy looked like someone who couldn't even get words out of him with a pincer. He turned to the rest of the boys, assuming that they were tired after the road. He decided to take them to rest, and he wanted to talk to them in more detail there. The guys were silent. Suddenly, Young-shin pointed his thumb at Seonho and ordered Eunchul to kill him right there. Young Hae-soo, holding onto Seonho and clinging tightly to him, raised his frightened eyes at him. All the guys were confused and scared. The men shouted approvingly from the balconies. Jong-han confusedly asked Young-sin what he had just said. Yoon-chul, spitting up the oozing blood, walked over to Seon-ho and gloatingly said that he was his now. Seon-ho looked at him angrily. Chonhan excitedly yelled for them to stop. Young-shin thought he was related to him. That wasn't the point. But Chonhan wasn't allowed to speak. Young-shin asked them to ignore it and explained that sometimes people would show up to complicate things, and to avoid future problems, they solve them in advance. But if the guys wanted to help, Young-shin wasn't going to stop them. But they hadn't encountered shots like this before. The guys stood scared. Yeon Hae-soo stood abruptly in front of Song-ho, covering him with himself. He shouted what they were doing and promised that if they laid a finger on him, he wouldn't let them get away with it. Yoon-chul loomed over him and said that there had always been those who butted into the conversation like he did, and everyone who had survived so far had a temper that wasn't sugar. These they treated with special cruelty. They didn't just take and kill. They never choose such a simple and boring path. To begin with, they would crush the bones in the whole body, making sure that the person would not die before time, and then hang them where they would be seen from all sides. And right where they were standing now was the best view. That's how the men's company had fun, being in such a boring place, because there were no sports on TV. After they watched a man dangle from the ceiling and slowly die, it stirred their blood so much that there was no trace of boredom. Eunchul warned the guys that compared to sports broadcasts, he liked this kind of thing much better. And young Hae-soo the blonde promised that he would abuse Seon-ho so viciously, right under the dangler hanging over his head so he could see the whole process clearly. After hearing all of Yoon-chul's dirty promises, young Hae-soo, trembling with fear with his whole body, turned to the rest of the guys and suggested that they leave this place right now. He kept calling out to them, but the guys didn't answer. Soon-ho pulled out a knife. Young Hae-soo was even more frightened. The black-haired man stared resolutely in front of him. Suddenly, he was addressed and advised to temper his ardor. The guy turned around. A guy with multicolored eyes was sitting next to him. He boredly told him that if he lived like that, he would die quickly. The main one looking at Xiangho didn't understand how he had managed to live to this day. The man stood up. The guys immediately noticed that there was shouting and clamor in the room the whole time. But as soon as the man appeared, everyone immediately quieted down. The guy with multicolored eyes looked at Seon-ho with an interested look. He said that if he wanted to protect this guy, he had to replace his seat. Song-ho was surprised. The mixed-eyed man stepped up close to him, ordering him to put the knife down, warning him that if he continued to show his temper, he would die quickly. They looked at each other for a while. There was a deafening silence in the room. The black-haired guy asked if he did, if the boy would be touched. Seon-ho guessed that he was the one everyone here was listening to. The mixed-eyed man shouted sharply to the men not to touch the newcomers. After giving orders to the men, he looked at Seonho, smiled, and confirmed that he was in charge. No one could even get a word in edgewise to him, the guys warily looking around the upper floors. Sunho started to put the knife away, noticing this. The mixed-eyed man thought he would already continue his rampage, but the guy was really going to replace the boy, so he considered that the protagonist lacked a sense of self-preservation. Young Hesu looked sadly at Songho and turned to the man in charge, but seeing his crazy eyes, he shrank back. The sight of that man made him uneasy. He felt scared. The boy started to call out to Sonyo worriedly, but the black-haired man wasn't listening. He cared if the mixed-haired man was ready to take responsibility for his words. The man cheerfully replied that the more he looked at Seonho, the more he liked him. Discord turned to Yongshin and told him that he had to handle the rest himself and ordered him not to touch Sonyo's comrades. Yongshin shouted uncomprehendingly what he was going to do. The man admitted that he was going to have fun with Seonho. Young Hesu put his arm around the guy's waist again and pressed down, the other guys standing in shock. Yongshin was also surprised that Rasoglazi was going to do this. The man didn't understand his reaction. After all, they did it all the time. Yongshin didn't care about that, but was surprised that he was the one who wanted to get into it out of the blue. The wide-eyed man looked at the boy thoughtfully and said that he liked bespectacled men. He didn't see any others wearing glasses here. Silence hung around. The mixed-eyed man was smiling charmingly. He suddenly offered his hand to the protagonist. Sonho looked at him confused, but still held out his hand, the man pulling him sharply to him and leading him behind him. Young Hesu started to call out to Seonho in a panic. The guy, not looking at the kid, asked him not to do anything that the others might be interested in, and promised to come back soon. Jisoo kept yelling and wanted to go after them, but the guy in the group wrapped his arms around him and held him in place, not letting him leave. Changon turned to Jonhan Hyun, the guy worriedly noting that they had come to a very large base. The wide-eyed man led the lad to his room, plumping himself on the bed, and told him that there used to be a furniture store here, and it was a room he used alone. As Sonho looked around the room, the man said that he loved the spaciousness, so he set up a room for himself here. He could do whatever he wanted. The guy asked why they brought them here. The guys had a very long walk to their base. It was strange that there were no people around. Sonho guessed they had already used them and threw them out. So this abnormal group had to walk a long way before them, but here they were taking them. It was important for Sonyo to know what they were going to do now. The wide-eyed man didn't answer. Tilting his head to the side, he asked how tall the protagonist was. The guy stared at him in surprise. The man didn't like anyone who was taller than him. He assumed the guy was over 180. He didn't like it that way. It should have been less. The protagonist replied that he was 179. The man was 186. He was glad he was taller and started mocking. But the guy last measured his height 5 years ago when he was in high school, so he must be taller than him now. The man was surprised to hear this, but smiled and replied that he was his type. Divergent began unbuttoning Sonyo's jacket, asking if he had ever had fun with a man. Since Seongho had volunteered to be in that guy's place, there was a set price to pay. Sonho immediately remembered the horrible and humiliating experience with the man and told the dissimilar-eyed man about it. Neither of them had had fun with their sex, a disagreement that made it difficult, for he expected to learn from Sonyo how to do it. The black-haired man unzipped the fly on his pants, and since the guy's experience was such, he decided he worked well with his mouth. Sonho, taking the hood off his head, said he could do whatever he wanted with him because that was the condition, but asked him to let him leave when it was over. He warned that it wasn't necessary to let everyone who came with him go, but asked only him and young Hesu to leave. The man gave him a disgruntled look and replied that it all depended on how he handled it. During the next process, Sunho suddenly pulled out a knife. The man wondered why he pulled it out. It squeezed his hand painfully. The boy screamed and let the weapon out of his hands, because the pain was as if the mixed-eyed man was going to break his arm. The man asked why he got him. After all, they had already discussed it. But in the end, not waiting for an answer from the guy, he decided to turn a blind eye to such nonsense because he had never felt so good. Sonho screamed deafeningly. The man regained his senses and let go of his hand and apologized. He wasn't in control during the process and asked the guy to scream if he did the same in the future. Yongshin, as they went up to the assigned rooms, told them that since this was a central, densely populated area, there were a lot of infected people. It would have been safer to leave the city, But the abundance of supplies tipped the scales. He thought hard about how to survive in a place like this, and the obvious option came to him: hunting creatures. Turning his head slightly toward the boys, he told them that they were required to let the infected chase them around at will. In order for the plan to work, we needed hardy people who could run for long periods of time and would not die even if they got hurt. There were several other factions nearby that were busy doing the same thing. They had profit in common with them. The main thing, they had to be careful not to mistake the monsters for humans. He led them to a room with only lonely mattresses and nothing else in it. The guy said it used to be a shopping center, but they took everything out and put mattresses in. The guys were able to stay here for now. To begin with, he told them to rest and later promised to bring food, chonhan, something he wanted to say. Young-sin remarked that he had scared them too much, but promised that it wouldn't be long before they realized how lucky they were to join their group, for they had something even monsters were afraid of. Young Hesu excitedly asked him to tell him where Seonho had been taken. Young Shin replied that the guy would come back in time since he wasn't dead, and turned around to leave. Already walking down the corridor, Young Shin realized what nonsense he had said. But still, Seongho had turned out to be with a crazy guy from whom you never know what to expect. Really, Young Shin really hoped it wouldn't be as messy as last time. Since they had barely cleaned up, he was too lazy to deal with it again. Young Sin came to the dissimilar, warily asking if the guy was even alive. He caught them right in the middle of their entertainment. Young Sin looked at them in disgust. He was telling the man in charge that it was time for the newcomers to be put into action. If he was going to move out, without hearing any answers to his questions, he finally asked if he was going to torture Seonho for long. The kid's face was all bloody. The man hovering over him said this kid was his now. He was thinking of locking him up here forever. Young Shin gave a disdainful look and said that as long as he was up to the task, he didn't care what he was doing. Before he left, he asked him to try not to kill Sonyo and go out to the others. Young Shin also reminded him that the guy needed to be fed since humans were a little different from him. The wide-eyed man asked Young Shin in a friendly manner to bring them some food. The guy angrily told him he could bring it himself. The guys were also brought canned food to eat. Everyone was happy, and only Yon Hesu looked sadly at one of the cans. The guys noticed his mood. They guessed that he was worried about Sunho. They asked him to eat, because he might not even have the strength left to worry. Chang Gong suddenly asked the blonde-haired man what kind of relationship he and Songho had. They were definitely not related, but Songho was shaking on him in such a way that it seemed their relationship was deeper than kinship. Young Hesu, looking at the canned food, said that he was in the mountains that day when the strange message came over the radio. In the bushes, he spotted Xiongho all covered in blood. Xiongho, being delirious from the pain, told the dissimilar. He still regretted that he couldn't save that guy and ran away. It seemed ridiculous to the man. After all, he himself was under attack. He had no reason to save anyone else. The guy closed his eyes, remembering the frightened face of that guy. The dissenter said he looked in his direction, but it didn't matter to him. Then Sonyo remembered that he seemed to be reaching out to him. Sunho really wanted to know that guy's name. The man replied that he knew his name. He kept running it through his head every now and then to memorize it forever. Divergent gave his name. His name was Vaughn, and he warned the lad that he was in no way to forget it. Songho suddenly came to his senses, all curled up. He screamed in pain. His whole body ached. His face, body, and fingers were covered in blood. One warned right away that he didn't do it. He said that Sunho was spinning his head like a lunatic, so his face was covered in blood. Sunho looked at him. The man seriously said there was no way he would hit him, and he never hit him once. The guy with glasses clenched his teeth. With a trembling hand, he reached for his clothes. The mixed-eyed man kept saying why the guy was bleeding. He spun his head around and banged on everything. Sonho irritably replied that he didn't care if he hit him or it was his own fault, so asked him to shut up already finally. He threw on his jacket, angrily spitting out whether he'd played enough, and if satisfied, Sonyo asked to let him and his friend go now, for that was the deal. Vaughn looked at him seriously and said he didn't want to, because he told him he was going to watch the guy handle it. He ended up liking it so much that it started to blow his mind, and if he hadn't liked anything, even a small detail, he would have immediately thrown Xiongho out without a second thought. But now he was sorry to lose such a shot. Songho gritted his teeth helplessly and angrily called Vaughn a bastard, and the boy slanted his eyes sideways. This gesture did not go unnoticed by Vaughn. The man guessed that the lad was looking for a knife. He indicated to him that the weapon lay to his left. Sonho looked at the knife. The mixed-eyed man urged him to pick up the knife, because this was something he had fun playing too. The guy looked at him sullenly, breathing heavily. Suddenly, he was twisted in half. Sunho asked him to stop and finally let him out of this room. But one didn't want to let him go anywhere. Sunho called him names. The mixed-eyed man started saying some not-so-nice things, but urged the guy to notice that he was kindly listening to him and not doing what he could have done. The big-eyed man kindly asked Sonyo to stop being angry and resentful toward him. His face was covered in blood, both nostrils dripping with blood, shadows under his eyes, anger bubbling in his eyes. The man looked back at him and bowed his head and laughed, saying that at this rate, Sonyo would burst with anger. He reminded the guy that he was the only reason his friend was safe and sound, so at least with that, he had to earn a modicum of leniency. And one really didn't want to let go of Seonho. The guy crouched down and holding his ribs, silent. Vaughn asked him to stop looking at him so angrily and pointed to look at what was against the wall. There were bottles of water against the wall, and the mixed-eyed man told him to drink some water, for his throat must be dry. The boy, only now noticing that his mouth was dry, grabbed one of the bottles and greedily began to drink. Sonho coughed. One graciously allowed Sonho to return to his friend, the boy staring at him incredulously. The man said he couldn't let him go outside. However, he allowed the two of them to hang out together. But he had a condition, and afterward he asked him to look in the bag next to the bottles. There was canned food. One promised to let Seonho go when he ate it all. All the guys had long since slept, and only young Haesu was sitting with his head down near the wall. He remembered their acquaintance. It was a clear day. A depressed Sonho was sitting on the ground. Haesu approached him, asking if his name was Sonho. He read his name on his name tag. The boy didn't answer anything. He had been in the mountains with the blonde-haired man for a week now and still hadn't uttered a word. Sonho turned his head even more away from Haesu. The blonde-haired man smiled at him and told him that he had climbed the mountain about 2 months ago. He was scared, but the people around him said it was safe here. But he himself thought that the infected would come to their neighborhood too. Sonho didn't turn around. The guy was quiet for a moment and then began to talk about everything around him that he saw and heard. Eventually, after a while, the black-haired man turned his head to him. They looked at each other and Haesu was all brightened up, blushing and smiling full mouth. Seongho slowly started to come to his senses. Now Haesu was sitting in a dark room with his head bowed down and kept repeating the black-haired man's name. Suddenly Sonyo appeared in front of him. The guy immediately jumped up and immediately peppered him with questions about where he'd been missing, and if everything was okay, and if anything was wrong with him. He hugged him and whimpered. He asked if Seongho was in one piece and hurt, but the guy was silent. After some words from Jisoo, he did ask if Jisoo was hurt. The guy immediately shouted that he was fine. Then Sonyo relaxed and mused that he would get some sleep. The boy lay down. Haesu was still relentless and called out to his friend again, but Sonyo fell into slumber as soon as his head touched the mattress. The blonde looked at him in surprise, and then crouched down next to him and examined Sonyo. He pulled back his jacket and was surprised to notice the marks and bites. The old pervert was torturing Seongho in the mountains. The boy was sitting between his legs. The man was displeased with him and threatened to call Haesa. He grabbed his bangs and lifted his head up. The pervert began to rebuke the guy for feeding and guarding them for years for a reason. So he threatened that if the guy didn't improve his skills, he'd have to go back to the bottom of the mountain. Sonho continued. The door was ajar, and through the small slit Haesu was looking at them, he was in a huge shock. The perverted man opened his eyes abruptly in the night. Haesu was sitting on him, brandishing a knife over him. The guy poked the knife right into the man's chest. The pervert grabbed him by the hair and pulled him towards him. The blonde screamed. He started asking what he was doing. The guy kept pushing the knife in deeper. Calling Jisoo an ungrateful brat one last time, blood whipped from the pervert's mouth and his eyes glazed over forever. The guy took the man's hand off his head and sobbed, his head aching. He walked outside, wiping away his tears. Sonho was walking towards him, seeing him. Haesu's bloodied face stretched into a smile. The guy looking at the blonde-haired man warily froze. Now in the dark room, Sonyo rolled over onto his back and opened up the full view of his body. Haesu froze in surprise as he examined the many marks and bites. The day came. Won and Yongshin were gathered on the roof of the building. They were talking about something, agreeing on something. Yongshin nodded in agreement. All the guys woke up. Haesu was sitting across from Sonyo, who was sitting on his bunk with his head down. The guys didn't know when their comrade came back because they were knocked out, so they didn't hear anything. One of the group came to them and yelled for the newcomers to get up on the roof. As they climbed the stairs, Sunho began to lurch sideways on one of the turns, but Changgonu picked him up in time, anxiously asking if he was okay. The guy looked at him indifferently. His jacket opened and his whole body showed to his comrade. Changgong noticed the bite around his nipple, blushed, and hurriedly turned away. Hesu walked over to Songho, put his arm around his waist and said he would help him walk. Changgong was happy to hand the kid over to him. As they climbed up, Sonyo was wobbling in different directions. He asked the black-haired man if he would tell him what happened. The protagonist remained silent. Through the force, he replied he didn't need to know that. Jisoo guessed the guy was trying to protect him again. He had been told many times not to do that. The blonde hugged him. Everyone went up to the roof. There were a huge number of infected wandering around below. Chanhal looked down and stammered, asking what it was, why there were so many of them. Changgong remembered exactly that the last time they went up, there were only a couple of creatures walking around downstairs. Youngshin asked them to look at the red building across the road. Those who were hiding there had gone outside yesterday. A few were eaten as soon as they appeared outside. Then, smelling the blood, all the infected that were in the vicinity flocked here. The survivors would either starve to death or be captured and eaten as soon as they came out. Youngshin assured the guys that they didn't need to worry about such a thing. After all, he had told them that they wouldn't regret joining them. The guys remained silent. The guy went on to say that there was a big supermarket nearby, but because there's a lot of corrosive, the other factions don't dare to even go near it. This kept the supply of provisions intact, and the whole catch was that 2 of the newcomers had to go there today and get them some food. Changgong shouted that with all those creatures outside, he was now directly telling them to go to certain death. Youngshin calmly warned that the monsters would move into the neighborhood tonight, but the guys didn't believe him after all. How could he know that? Youngshin said that they had something so scary that even monsters couldn't touch them. One had to take them to a nearby neighborhood, so it should be quiet at night. Jensen recalled that Vaughn had also chosen the day they arrived here, so they were able to make it safely without encountering any infected along the way. He asked them to rely on him and go get provisions. Youngshin began to look at the boys appraisingly. He pointed to Changhal and Janggong, saying one of them would go, and then pointed to young Hesu and Seonho, saying one of them would go. Yongsin, without naming exactly who would go, went on to say that if they did not return with provisions by 9 a.m. tomorrow, the rest would be killed. They were supposed to move out at 7 p.m. Before that time, they should let him know who was going to the supermarket. He called it a welcoming ceremony and warned that if they didn't come back empty-handed, they would indeed become part of their crazy family. The guys started talking amongst themselves. Changgong said he would go, but Changhal called him out warningly. The black-haired man reminded the guy that he was a fast runner and promised to run there and back in a flash. Gonu asked not to worry about him. Changhal didn't like that. He kept quiet. Meanwhile, Hesu yelled at Sonyo not to talk nonsense, for he was barely on his feet, so he volunteered to run to the store for him. But the black-haired man firmly said he wasn't allowed. Young Hesu froze, then shook all over, blushed, and lowered his eyes resentfully. Yunchul impatiently asked if they'd be dragging the rubber for long, and who ends up going to the supermarket. He warned that they had locked the food warehouse. The blonde handed the key to the guys and a bag to bring food in. The man turned to Sonyo with a chuckle, asking if he was going to the store. He grimaced as he promised to show his precious friend special care. Sunho stopped. The man turned him around by his arm, asking if he wanted to punch him. The guy glared at him angrily. Yunchul lowered his eyes and said it would be better if his buddy went to the supermarket and he died right there at his hands. Sonho was breathing hard. He was shaking all over and some areas were stabbing with pain. The man grabbed him by his jacket and pinned him against the wall. Yunchul ordered him not to hope for an easy death. He promised to put his whole soul in and smear every bit of his body, and would do it slowly, savoring it. Young Sin called out to him and told him to stop because one already had his eye on him. But Yunchul, staring at Seonho in disbelief, replied that if he was so valuable, he would have kept him to himself. But he let him wander wherever he could, as if he wanted the guy to be touched once more. Vaughn stared at him with his different eyes and wondered what he was going to do next. The man looked at Seonho. Yunchul cried out fearfully. Vaughn, ignoring the blonde man's fussing, turned to the black-haired man, saying he knew he shouldn't have let him out of the room because he knew there was going to be some messing up. Seonho was breathing heavily. Yunchul didn't understand why one had come. He didn't understand since when he was interested in the affairs of newcomers. Sunho stared angrily at the blonde man. The man swallowed and let go of his hand, and Vaughn immediately replied that it was okay to keep his hand there, because if there was anger, it was better to let it out. One promised to prepare a place where Yunchul could vent. He said cheerfully that they would clash now in front of his eyes as they should. Yunchul stared at him fearfully. He didn't understand what the man in charge meant. One could see that the blonde had a pent-up grievance, and they had one way to settle it: a one-on-one fight. The blonde looked at Xiongho and grinned, and the mixed-eyed man noticed that Yunchul didn't like the idea, but he'd said he wanted to stretch the pleasure. He said that if the blonde won, he would give the boy to him for his own use. Everyone was shocked. The most shocked was Jesu. Yunchul suddenly shouted that he didn't give a shit about him, but when he saw his naked torso and the marked areas of skin that looked so tempting and tantalizing to him, he stared mesmerized. One once again asked if he really didn't need Xiongho. The tortured guy didn't look good, but his whole look expressed determination, anger, and resilience. Yunchul couldn't look away. Vaughn urged him to stop annoying the guy surreptitiously and advised him to take it and eat while it was being served. With crazy eyes, he said that Xiongho was delicious, for he knew because he had already tasted it. Yunchul smirked cruelly and said that if he broke it now, from now on, no matter what he did with it, one wouldn't care. The mixed-eyed man confirmed it with a smile. Sunho glanced angrily at Vaughn's smiling face. The man waved him off. The whole group gathered on the upper floors, with Yunchul and Sionho standing across from each other downstairs. Changgong worriedly told Chonghal that he knew that Sunho, because of his temper, would one day fall into something like this. Yongshin announced the rules. Once the fight started, one could not interfere. Kill or let live would decide at their own discretion. The main thing was to finish the fight quickly. Sunho glanced at Heisu. The guy worriedly looked at him in anticipation the whole time. Suddenly his face contorted fearfully. He called out to the black-haired man. A strong blow came from the side. His glasses immediately flew off his nose and clattered to the floor, and the guy coughed. Yunchul, rubbing his fist, admitted that he originally liked soft and feminine guys. Before Xiongho's eyes were cloudy and everything was blurry, he needed his glasses. He pulled his trembling hands and quickly pulled them back up. Suddenly, from behind, he was grabbed by his hair and pulled towards him. The blonde man took him from behind by the neck and started choking him. Cresting, Sonyo placed his palm exhaustedly on the hand holding his neck. While the guy was lurching, Yunchul was wondering how awesome it tasted that even Crazy One had become obsessed with it. Divergent watched their fight from afar with his hands in his pockets. The blonde admitted it was different from his original plan, but he was glad to at least see his crying face beneath him. The hand around the guy's neck slid under his jacket, and the other hand clamped around his bitten nipple, and Sonyo grunted harder and tried fiercely to disentangle himself, but nothing was working. His nasty hands holding the guy's weakened body down. The blonde kept babbling about how Vaughn didn't give a shit about all the smarmiest guys. He clenched Sonyo tighter, wondering just how ratty he tasted. A red bruise blossomed on the guy's cheek. He grunted harder than before. Seeing this, the blonde guy was turned on by it. He pulled his hand to his pants. After some very gruesome and unpleasant manipulation of Sonyo's body, the boy cried out in pain. This only turned the blonde on even more. He smiled cruelly and said the nastiest words in the guy's ear, right in front of everyone. Yunchul wanted to take advantage of the guy right here and now, but Xiongho swung the back of his head at his nose with his last strength. The hard blow made the man finally let go of the guy and crouched down, holding his face. His nose was shattered, and with furious eyes, Yunchul turned toward him, but Xiongho had a knife in his hand, and he swung it in time to stab the stricken pervert in the chest. The boy clenched his teeth in anger and pressed the blade in harder. The blonde slumped onto his back, Sionho along with him. Everyone stared at them in astonishment. Yunchul, staring at the knife sticking out of his chest, shouted. Sonho loomed over him and approached, gloatingly asking who was going to crawl under whom. Yunchul shouted fiercely and pushed Xiongho off him with his foot. He got up vigorously, panicking and asking what the hell this was about and where he got the knife from. Xiongho leaning on his hands, his whole body shaking finely. Suddenly one shouted joyfully from his seat, saying that he was the one who gave him the knife. Yongshin already wanted to express his displeasure to him, but the mixed-eyed man said he didn't interfere in the fight and gave the knife in front of him. Yunchul shakily brought his hand to the handle of the knife. He stared at the knife fearfully, tears streaming from his eyes. Vaughn, laughing from his seat, advised him not to pull him out, for the blood might flow and then he might die. Seong-ho was still lying face down on the floor. He raised his angry eyes to Yoon-chul. The blonde man looked at him dumbfounded. Won kept his eyes on them as well. Yoon-chul completely freaked out and started saying they were rotten brats. He was asked to calm down, but the man yelled for them to take their hands off. Young-sin calmly reminded the monster of what would be for breaking the rules, and also warned that if he didn't get treatment in time, he would get worse. Tears flowed from his eyes and he made unintelligible noises. Then Young-shin reminded him that he would have to fight Won. He gritted his teeth, looked at Song-ho, clenched his knife, and walked past the boys, tears still flowing. Won squatted down to the guy. He gave him a knife for Sonho to kill him, because if you don't do what you need to do in time, the problems will come back many times over. Sonho glanced at him, then dropped his head onto his arm without strength. The mixed-eyed man taking the boy in his arms, telling him he was going to have a hard time from here on out. This was watched from afar by a startled Jizu. Sonho woke up again in the nurse's station. He immediately realized he was asleep because he had had this dream very often. He remembered that now, when he went outside, he would see that guy being swept away again by a mob of infected, and then the zombies would pounce on him. He could see their creepy appearance in front of him. He turned in his head and suddenly he saw Vaughn in the window. He was looking at him creepily from a small slit. Sonho opened his eyes abruptly, a mixed-eyed man looming over him. The boy abruptly pushed himself away and quickly sat down across from the man. He stood up and started frantically swiveling his head. Vaughn asked him to calm down. After all, he was in his room. But the boy could not calm down, and suddenly he came across the same sight he had seen in his dream, his face staring perplexedly at the wall. One noticed something was wrong and asked why the guy had that look on his face. He assumed that Sunho wasn't happy to be here again. The man reminded the guy that he had almost died when he left the room, and was now asking him to recognize that he was safe around him. Suddenly, Seong-ho clutched at his stomach. He was shaking all over. He still asked to be sent back. Divergent didn't want to let him go. After all, he was safe here. So he asked him to relax and forget about his fear. But Sunho shouted that he wasn't afraid of anything. But it wasn't like that. Vaughn could sense that the guy was very much afraid. He was aware of that because the man had been looking only at him uninterruptedly during the fight. He noticed that Seong-ho was so scared that he was having a hard time dealing with his fear. One claimed that the guy was afraid of a lot of things. The guy looked at him and then shuddered again. The man smiled, but then, as if seeing something, wondered if he hated him. Sunho stood with his head down. One clearly heard the guy say he hated him. The man didn't understand why Sunho felt that way about him. In his opinion, he cared for him a lot. The boy remained silent, only looking angrily directly into Wan's eyes. The mixed-eyed man was immediately surprised that Sunho was finally looking him in the eye, for before he had always averted his gaze. Not waiting for any response from Seong-ho, the man concluded that the answer to him consisted of 3 words about hating him. Vaughn looked at him interestedly, the boy wary. Eventually, the man decided to slowly develop other emotions. The wide-eyed man suddenly stood up. Sonyo flinched, the man looking at the boy with his blue eyes and said he would get him and then do whatever he wanted. Sonho finally asked why the man was acting this way with him and what exactly he wanted. One smilingly admitted that he fell in love with him at first sight. Seonho's face all twisted. Divergent, seeing his reaction, was surprised. This kind of face of Sonho's was over the top. The guy hurt him more than saying he didn't like him. The nurse's station patched up Yoon-chul. He menacingly asked the guy to get the hell out of here, the comrade bandaging his wound and hurriedly running away from the blonde man. The wound was stabbing. The man remembered their fight with Sonho. It made him immediately horny. It made him shake. Covering his face with his hand, he promised the kid would dance some more. He wasn't going to give him to anyone. Back in high school, Sonho was harassed by guys. Other guys would look out watching the fight. One of them said that Sonho had an explosive temper. The other one asked about the guy with glasses because he always looked quiet. But the guy said that Seong-ho was a mad dog with no brakes. He was usually quietly reading books off to the side, so everyone thought he was an easy target, which is why a lame-ass guy decided to get to him one day. But Sonho immediately hit him in the head with a chair. The other guy was silent, watching the kid. It was the same guy Sonho didn't save on the day of the infection. One kept asking Seonho why he was so angry, because he actually wanted to look good in his eyes. He asked him to tell him why he pissed him off, and then he promised to be more careful. Sunho asked what could be good about a man like him who didn't keep his word and only did as he pleased. Vaughn didn't understand what the guy was carrying. After all, he had fulfilled all the conditions that Sonyo had set for him, and also believed that if the guy didn't like the outcome, it was him who had mispronounced the terms. So he asked him to now think things through well first, and then speak up so that no one would be offended. Song-ho began to talk about his hardships at first, and that continued afterward. In this new world, he had always lived by the principle of giving one thing and getting another in return, which had gone to waste. Nothing could be put in order. He blamed everything on one because after he met him, Song-ho was constantly angry because he couldn't find a solution to any problem. The man didn't understand why he had to think so much. After all, he would be safe next to him. It must be great. Sonho asked that if he found himself dissatisfied with something, he would want to have fun with him again. The mixed-eyed man smiled and admitted that this arrangement was very much to his liking. The guy couldn't stand it and punched him in the face with all his might, shouting various swear words. He wanted to punch him again, but Vaughn reached out and suddenly put his arms around his waist and pulled him to him. Sunho continued to beat him anyway, and they plopped down on the bed together, one clenching him harder, pulling him close to him. Divergent, looking at him calmly, said that his body wasn't in the best shape and he was overexerting himself. Sunho gasped for breath and elbowed Vaughn in the chest. He was screaming and trying very hard to hurt him, but the man just stared at him, and not a single muscle on his face trembled. The guy stopped punching. He wrapped his hands around Vaughn's throat and started choking him, saying who was he looking down on and promising to kill him. But one didn't do anything but stare at him creepily. The mixed-eyed man noticing the choking imprint on Sunho's neck from the fight with Unchul. With creepy eyes, he said that he had to do away with Yunchul himself. Suddenly, he moved closer to Seonho and kissed him. He told the guy to get some sleep for starters, and after he was well rested, he promised to let him have as much fun as he wanted. A cheerful one with a battered face appeared in front of Youngsun. The guy didn't realize what his appearance was. He realized he had been beaten. One began to brag that Seonho had grabbed him by his sweater and yanked. He now had a hole in it. He was very perturbed by the guy's behavior. Youngshin to himself also noted that a chunk of the man's hair had been ripped out. Sunho himself was sitting in the corner, breathing heavily. He glared angrily at Youngshin. The jacketed kid glanced back at him worriedly, thinking that one was taming a wild animal. One grabbed a bottle of water and threw it to Sunho. The guy immediately grabbed it and started drinking greedily. The man laughed. One was thrilled that the guy attacked him as if he wanted to kill him. But all the food he throws at him, eating because he didn't want to die. It was amazing to him, Youngshin thought to himself, that a meeting of two plagues had taken place. The guy in the jacket remarked that he was having a hard time. One confirmed that Sonhyo's temper wasn't sugar. Then the guy suggested putting a collar on him. Vaughn didn't want to put a collar on him, because then it would make it uncomfortable for Sunho to pounce on him. He absolutely didn't want to do something so boring. Youngshin remained silent. Suddenly, one remembered something and cheerfully asked if he had brought him what he had asked for. Youngshin pulled out the ointment and handed it to the man. The mixed-eyed man headed towards Seonho. The guy flinched and started to get up from his seat. Walking up to him, Vaughn said he didn't like to act rough, but sometimes he had to show a dash of firmness. The guy stared at him fearfully. Divergent grabbed his arm and pulled him towards him. He lowered him headfirst into the floor and pulled his pants down. Sonho twisted and turned around, not realizing what was going on. One told him not to fidget. After all, he needed to apply the medicine to make it heal quickly.